When the Clutter family went to bed on November 14, 1959, they had no way of knowing that they'd never see morning again. Before that could happen, they would become victims to one of the most infamous crimes in American history. After two men broke into their home during the early morning hours of November 15th, then proceeded to massacre them, it would start a chain of events that would lead to a nationwide manhunt, a major trial, and the involvement of Truman Capote as the man who largely created a new genre of novel off the back of what happened, the genre of true crime. This is Monsters. Before we begin, I just want to take a moment to tell you about my new headphones. I've been wanting a pair of these for a while, and now that I have them, I wish I'd gotten them sooner. These are the Heavys, the world's first headphones built for heavy metal and more. They have 8 drivers with patented speaker placement, creating a naturally immersive sound field, mimicking a live experience. But they aren't just for heavy metal. These headphones sound great with any genre. Many of you know I'm a big old punk rocker, and these are great for that. I've tested them with rock, pop, and even lighter acoustic music, and it all sounds amazing. These headphones not only sound good, but they feel good. They cover my whole ear, and even though they're lightweight, they don't feel flimsy. The battery life is incredible, with 50 hours with noise canceling off and 40 hours with it on. They also have these things called shells. They're like skins for your headphones, and there are a select group of artists you can get shells for, such as Motorhead, like here. They also have artists like Cannibal Corpse, Dropkick Murphys, or even Body Count. On top of that, they have the Hex gaming attachment, so you can bring immersive audio to your co-op gaming sessions. If you want to listen to your music with incredible quality and comfort, pick up a pair of Heavys H1H headphones today. You can either use the promo code MONSTERS or use the link in the description to get $40 off your order. Again, that's promo code MONSTERS for $40 off your order. Herbert Clutter was very well respected within his local community of Holcomb, Kansas, a small Midwestern town known mostly for its abundance of farmland. The reason he was so respected was because, as the owner of River Valley Farm, he'd gained a reputation for being very good to the many farm hands he employed. He was known for his fair wages above all else. On top of that, he was also praised for being a positive force within his local community in other ways. He was a regular fundraiser for the First United Methodist Church of Garden City and the chairman of the Kansas Conference of Farm Organizations. The idea that anyone would want to bring harm to Herbert or his family seemed ridiculous, as everyone agreed he was a good man, someone who, along with his wife, was raising a good family. When it came to his wife, Bonnie Clutter, life was not always so rosy for her. While she was very much in love with her husband, and while she doted on her children regularly, a bad case of clinical depression that had begun following the birth of her oldest daughter had led to her struggling for several years prior to the events of November 15, 1959. Things had gotten so bad for her that she'd reportedly sought treatment at the nearby Wesley Medical Center as a psychiatric inpatient a number of times throughout the 40s and 50s. A tough burden for her to bear, not only because she had a family to raise, but also because there was still an incredible stigma surrounding mental illness back in those days. The severity of her mental health issues has been disputed by members of the Clutter family in the years since her death, with some claiming it wasn't as bad as it would later be portrayed in the book In Cold Blood. Even if that was the case, it was still true that her psyche was not in a good place as the 60s dawned. The woman who had grown up idolizing Florence Nightingale and who had eventually followed in her footsteps by becoming a nurse was struggling on a daily basis. That was no doubt exacerbated by the fact that 2 of her 4 children had already left the nest by then and were building lives of their own. Both Ivana and Beverly Clutter were living with their respective families in 1959, with the former having a child of her own and the latter attending college. As for the youngest two, 16-year-old Nancy and her 15-year-old brother Kenyon, well, they were still very much a part of the family household. In fact, at least on Kenyon's part, he was rarely seen anywhere outside of the farm as he was known to be a very insular child. He was known to have few friends or romantic interests, despite being a tall, strong, and by all accounts handsome young man. Really, the only time he seemed interested in doing much of anything that didn't involve going to school was when he was either working on his father's old pickup truck or going rabbit hunting with his only close companion, a young boy named Bob Jones. But that appeared to be enough for him. For his sister, however, such a life would have driven her to madness as she was far more sociable and outgoing. She loved nothing more than taking her beloved horse Babe for a ride, playing clarinet in her high school band, or just spending time with her boyfriend Bobby Rupp, each of them living life to its fullest with every breath. As Bobby would later say when describing her, quote, "Nancy was really pretty. Brown hair, curled at the ends, sparkling eyes, a wide girlish smile. She had an easy laugh, and there wasn't a mean bone in her body. She was in 4-H, went to church every Sunday, and made top grades. Until her murder, Nancy Clutter was everyone's friend." But while life seemed to be going well for both Nancy and Kenyon in their own individual ways and their futures seemed bright, they were not long for the world. That was because the men who would soon be responsible for their deaths were already making plans to go to their property. Of course, the reason for that wasn't just because they wanted to kill someone, though. No, it was all about money. More specifically, it was about Herbert Clutter's money. It all started a few months prior when Richard Hickock and Perry Smith had both been sharing a cell together in the Kansas State Penitentiary. Richard was a troubled man born into a strict Christian family in Kansas City on June 6, 1921. He had fallen into a life of criminal activity during his teens when a car accident left him seriously injured, disfigured, and with a lot of medical bills to pay off. So with no way of making those payments through legal means, he'd taken to engaging in things like petty theft in order to get by. That meant any hopes he had of going to college one day were well and truly snuffed out by the time his 20s rolled around. By then, the son of Walter and Eunice Hickock was supplementing what little he was earning through low-paying manual labor jobs by both writing bad checks everywhere he went and trying his luck at gambling. As with almost all gamblers, though, all that did was lead him into increased debt, and given he had 3 children to support, that just created a vicious cycle where he felt the need to engage in even more crime in order to get by and ensure there was enough food on the table for his family. Obviously then, such a lifestyle eventually led to the police coming knocking at his door, and that in turn led to a 17-month prison sentence beginning in April of 1958. That caused his second wife and the mother of his children to leave him. But while that might have been a low point for Richard, all was not lost, as it was while in prison that he would meet Perry Smith. Perry was a little older than his soon-to-be partner in crime, with him being born on October 27, 1928 in Huntington, Nevada. Unlike the traditional Christian household Richard had been raised in, Perry was brought up by a pair of rodeo performers named Florence Flo Buckskin and John Tex Smith. They supplemented their family income by distilling and selling bootleg whiskey on the side. Unfortunately for the youngster, his mother would also die when he was 13 as a result of choking on her own vomit while in a drunken stupor, and that would lead to Perry and his siblings being sent to a Catholic orphanage after their father decided he wasn't able to raise them alone. Still, even if Tex didn't feel like he was up to the task of being a single father, he probably would have still done a better job than his children's new caretakers, because while at that orphanage, young Perry would be subjected to repeated bouts of physical and emotional abuse. At one point, one of the nuns who worked there allegedly tried to drown him, so when he eventually got out of the system, he was a very damaged young man. That led him to joining various street gangs and getting involved in a life of petty crime. Really, the only thing that gave Perry a sense of stability at all was the military, more specifically the United States Army, which he signed up for in 1948. While serving in the Korean War would instill some much-needed routine into the soon-to-be killer's life, it wouldn't tame him entirely. No, much of his spell over in Korea would see him be sent to the stockade for weeks at a time after getting in public fights, usually while drunk. In spite of that, though, by the time 1952 rolled around, Perry was awarded an honorable discharge from the service. From there, he made an attempt to return to civilian life, but that wasn't easy for him. In fact, no matter how hard he tried to go straight with honest work as a car painter, he continually found himself slipping back into acts like petty theft. Things would get even worse after a motorcycle accident left him with chronic pain in his legs and a sudden need to fund a painkiller habit. After he was caught robbing the Chandler sales barn in Phillipsburg, Perry was sentenced to 5 years behind bars at the Kansas State Penitentiary in March of 1956. He was while in the pen that he shared a cell with Richard Hickock, leading to the pair becoming friends. That said, that wouldn't be the only friend either man made while behind bars. Over the course of his stay in the penitentiary, Richard would have another cellmate, a man named Floyd Wells. And as it happened, prior to his arrest, Floyd Wells had spent a period of time working as a farmhand for Herbert Clutter. That meant he was all too aware of how good Herbert was when it came to paying his staff well, and also where he kept his money, or at least where he believed he kept his money. As Floyd would explain to Richard one night while they were alone in their cell, he had reason to believe there was a large safe in the Clutter house at River Valley Farm where all the family's cash was kept. And given how successful the farm was, that was a substantial amount, as much as $10,000. Over $100,000 today. Really, for anyone looking to make a big score with relative ease, that would be the mother lode by late 1950s standards, as all the thief would have to do is get past that family of four and they'd have enough money to keep themselves going for quite a while. Understandably then, that got Richard to thinking. He was by then due for early release in a matter of months, and that would be the perfect way to set himself up financially once he was back on the outside. So he kept the information in the back of his mind, and once he was given his freedom again in August of 1959, he started making moves to put his plan into motion. Before he could do anything else, however, he knew he needed an accomplice, someone who could help him get past the Clutter family and into that safe. That was why he got in touch with the only person he could trust on the outside at that point, Perry Smith. That's right, before Perry had himself been released from prison just 1 month prior, the two had vowed to remain in touch. Now that Richard was out again and in need of a friend, he wasted no time in contacting his old cellmate and letting him know about the plan he had to make them both a lot of money. The way Richard saw it, with $10,000 to split between them, they'd have more than enough money to make their way down to Mexico and start a whole new life there, free from American law. All Perry would have to do would be to violate his parole by returning to Kansas, a relatively small risk given how much they stood to walk away with. So, taken by the idea of having a fresh start in a new country, Perry agreed to the plan and drove over from Idaho, where he was living at the time, back to Kansas to meet his former cellmate, where the two immediately began going over the details of how they were going to commit the crime. First, they would have to make the 400-mile or 640-kilometer journey across the state to the River Valley Farm where the Clutters resided. On the way there, they had to stop over and buy some tools that would help them carry out their task, namely gloves and some rope. Of course, the pair had initially planned on picking up some ladies' stockings too that they could use to disguise their faces. But in the end they decided that wasn't necessary, as they realized the most efficient way to make sure they wouldn't be caught would be to leave no survivors. That's right, the plan was not only to take all the money in the safe, but also to kill the entire Clutter family. So when they arrived in Holcomb on November 14, 1959, they knew how little room there would be for error, as one simple mistake could see them be sent back to prison for the rest of their lives. That was why they took as much care as possible when they approached the residence during the early hours of November 15th. Luckily for them then, entry into the property would go ahead without a hitch, as upon approaching the main door, Perry and Richard found it to be unlocked. Probably because it was Kansas in 1959 and no one expected anything bad could happen in a small rural community like the one the Clutters were part of. But something bad was going to happen because after entering the house, the two criminals woke up the family and explained to them that they were there to take all the money that was in the safe. They told the Clutters that if they wanted to get out of the situation alive, they had better cooperate. After that, they took Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon into the bathroom on the second floor and locked them in there. Then they led Herbert into his office on the first floor. The story that Richard had heard from his prison buddy, because who could be more reliable than someone serving time in prison, was that the safe was in Herbert's office. Richard was surprised to learn that that was not true. At that point, Herbert tried to explain how there was no safe full of money on the property. In fact, there was no safe full stop. Rather, he never dealt in cash, instead conducting all of his business with checks. Of course, Richard didn't believe him. Naturally, he assumed Herbert was lying in order to try and stop himself from being robbed. So after looking around the first floor office and confirming that the safe was indeed not there, he and Perry retrieved Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon from the upstairs bathroom, tied the two girls up, and placed them back into their beds where they couldn't interfere with what was to come. After that, they took Kenyon and his father down to the basement where they proceeded to gag and tie up the young man, all before moving him to the adjoining playroom where he was told to remain seated on a small couch. Herbert was also bound and gagged, but unlike his son, he wouldn't get a comfortable sofa to lay on. No, possibly because his captors felt he was lying to them about the safe and they were upset with him, he was forced down onto the concrete floor of the furnace room, with only a mattress box to lay on. As he lay there, Richard and Perry returned upstairs as they resumed their search for the elusive safe full of money. But as they were now being forced to accept, there truly was no safe. And that led them to return down to the basement soon after, where they took out their anger on Herbert. It was Perry who would later admit to carrying out the actual act of slitting Herbert's throat, just as it would be him who would admit to then putting the farmer out of his misery by shooting him in the head. As to who actually killed the other three members of the family, though, well, that would be a matter of debate in the years following. Regardless of who actually pulled the trigger next, though, it was known that once Herbert had been killed, the two assailants went back into the playroom where Kenyon was being held and shot him once in the head with the shotgun, killing him instantly. Following that, Richard and Perry went back upstairs to the bedroom on the second floor where Bonnie and Nancy were tied up and unable to move. Once there, they ended the lives of the two women as well by shooting them each once in the head with the same shotgun. Allegedly, though, before that happened, Richard had wanted to sexually assault Nancy. The 16-year-old was only spared that final humiliation after Perry stopped his co-conspirator from doing so. Supposedly, Perry felt like it was an unnecessary cruelty to inflict upon her. That's right, even if he was happy to end the lives of all four members of the Clutter family, Perry still had some twisted sense of morality to him, enough to where sexual assault was a step too far. He even later claimed to have felt bad for killing the Clutters at all, with him saying he only did so because it was necessary to not leave any witnesses behind. As he would later put it when describing Herbert Clutter specifically to Truman Capote, quote, "I didn't want to harm the man. I thought he was a very nice gentleman, soft-spoken. I thought so right up until the moment I cut his throat." Whether he felt bad about it or not, Perry had indeed been responsible for the death of 4 innocent people on that evening, as had Richard. And they knew that should they be caught by the police, they'd likely meet their own end sooner rather than later, as the sentence they'd receive would no doubt be death. That's why they did everything they could to clean up any evidence that they'd even been at the Clutter house at all, including gathering up their spent shotgun shells so that they wouldn't be discovered and traced back to them later on down the line. Then they gathered anything of value they could find before fleeing the scene. Of course, what they could find that was of value wasn't much. Rather than $10,000 they had come hoping to earn for the robbery, the pair would instead leave with a portable radio that had belonged to Kenyon, a pair of binoculars, and less than $50 in cash. The only money left over from a check Herbert had cashed the day before. It wasn't exactly a life-changing haul, and that made it all the more terrible that 4 people had died over it. Still, it was better than nothing. So taking what they had, Perry and Richard headed south to Oklahoma, where they planned to have a brief stopover en route to Mexico. Meanwhile, the rest of the world was coming to learn what had become of the Clutter family. It was Clarence Ewalt, the father of one of Nancy's close friends, herself also named Nancy, who suspected something was wrong when he arrived at River Valley Farm later on November 15th. You see, as a Christian household, the Clutters always made sure to attend Sunday service at their local church. When they did, Nancy Ewalt liked to accompany them as she was a strong Christian as well. So as per their usual arrangement, she was driven to their home that morning by her father, where she planned to join the Clutters as they headed over to the First Methodist Church in nearby Garden City. Upon arrival at the farm, though, the Ewalts quickly discovered that no one was answering the door, a strange thing given they would have surely been expecting Nancy. So wondering if there had been a last-minute change of plans and the Clutters had been called away somewhere else, Clarence traveled a short distance to the house of Susan Kitwell, a local school teacher and mutual friend of the Clutter family, to see if she had any additional information as to their whereabouts. But Susan didn't have any additional information. In fact, she was surprised to learn that Herbert and his family hadn't greeted the Ewalts when they arrived. It was highly unlikely they'd leave for church without Nancy, and it was even less likely that they'd miss church entirely. All she could think of in terms of an explanation was that they accidentally overslept and hadn't heard someone knocking at the door. That was why she tried to call them from her house phone. When that didn't work, she agreed to go back over to the Clutters' home with Clarence and his daughter. For as much as no one involved wanted to worry, however, Clarence clearly had some concerns that they were going to find something bad back at River Valley Farm. That might have been why he at first chose to wait outside while his daughter and Susan went in to try and rouse the presumably sleeping family. Eventually, though, he realized that he really shouldn't be letting the two ladies wander around the house themselves if there was an issue inside. So he walked up to the kitchen door, only to be stopped in his tracks by the sound of his daughter screaming. Both the young girl and the school teacher accompanying her had discovered the bodies of Nancy and Bonnie in the second-floor bedrooms. As she would tell her father through a stream of tears as she ran outside toward him, quote, "She's dead. It's true, Daddy. Nancy's dead." For her part, though, Susan was still in denial as the young girl said that, which was exactly why she admonished her for making such a statement, telling her instead it was likely just a nosebleed. But then who could blame her for having such difficulty accepting what she had seen, especially when nothing like that had ever happened in their community before? It was like something ripped straight out of a nightmare. As she would soon have to accept, sometimes nightmares can become reality. That was confirmed when Clarence himself went inside and saw the bodies of the two women. Of course, the bodies of Bonnie and Nancy weren't all they found that morning. After further investigation, they also discovered the corpses of Herbert and Kenyon down in the basement, too. That was when Clarence tried to call the authorities from the Clutters' house phone, but the line was cut. He had to drive down the street to use a different phone. Soon after that, Sheriff Earl Robinson arrived on the scene to investigate, with him being completely shocked and disgusted by what he found. He wasn't the only member of law enforcement who would be taken aback by the brutality of the crimes. As Logan Sanford, director of the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, would later describe the situation to the Garden City Telegram, quote, "This is the goriest crime I have ever seen in Kansas." Not only were all four members of the Clutter family bound and, for the most part, gagged, with each having a shotgun wound to their head, but Herbert's throat had also been slashed, suggesting he had suffered prior to meeting his end. Soon, Sheriff Robinson was joined by a team of investigators who all had to figure out exactly why the Clutter family had been killed. Was it a simple case of a robbery gone wrong? That was certainly a possibility, as Herbert's empty billfold was found on the floor of his bedroom during a sweep of the house. But if it was, there couldn't have been much money taken, as it was known by those around him that Herbert usually dealt in checks instead of cash. Maybe it was just a random act of violence from a stranger then. Or perhaps it was someone who knew the family that had a vendetta against them. The only problem with the latter theory, though, was, given his good standing within the community, Herbert Clutter didn't have any known enemies, certainly not anyone who had a reason to kill him and his family. Whatever the reason, the reality was the same anyway, and that was 4 people were now dead. So as word spread throughout the local area, panic began to arise amongst those who lived there. And that panic got even worse once Al Dewey, the special agent for the Kansas Bureau of Investigation who was tasked with taking the lead on the case, held a press conference not long after to try and explain where the investigation was. In the process, he hinted that there may have been at least one accomplice, meaning there were potentially no less than 2 murderers roaming around free somewhere. Even when Special Agent Dewey tried to put the people at ease by telling them he didn't have any reason to believe anyone else's life was in danger, it did little to calm the situation. By then, all anyone could think about was what if their house was attacked next. And when the locals weren't thinking about that, they were speculating over who the killers might have been, with many of them wondering if maybe it hadn't been one of their own neighbors. Yes, everyone was a suspect in the minds of the public, and some of those people were suspects in the mind of the police too, which was exactly why Bobby Rupp, the boyfriend of Nancy Clutter, would be one of the first people questioned. After all, he would have been the last person to see the family alive, given he was at the Clutter house on the evening of November 14th. On top of that, an entry written in Nancy's diary prior to her death seemed to hint at a motive to have wanted to kill the family if he so desired. It seemed Herbert was not a fan of young Bobby, and according to his daughter's diary entry, he had pushed for Nancy to break up with him. In the end, though, Bobby would be ruled out as a suspect pretty quickly when his own family confirmed he had returned home that evening and was there with them all night. And he wasn't the only suspect ruled out early on. A neighbor known only as Mr. Smith's dog was shot after running amok on the Clutter property sometime before, and it was possible the man wanted revenge. Investigators also deemed him to be innocent of the crimes before long. After a certain point, it became harder and harder for authorities to find someone who they thought might have been genuinely guilty, especially as they were being swamped with telephone calls offering them false confessions in exchange for a reward. There was a brief concern about whether the killers would ever be caught. It was while that was happening that Truman Capote would first enter the picture. Truman Capote was by that point already one of the most respected writers of his era. Best known for novels like Other Voices, Other Rooms, and Breakfast at Tiffany's, the latter of which would be adapted into a hit movie of the same name. He first heard about the case of the Clutter family murders after reading a small story about them in the New York Times. At that point, he had the idea to go to Holcomb with his friend, Harper Lee, only the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of To Kill a Mockingbird. He wanted to research the crime for himself in the hopes of creating a new kind of book which he labeled a non-fiction novel. He spent the following weeks speaking to the people of Holcomb and trying to get a better idea about what had happened, as well as what kind of people the Clutter family were. Meanwhile, the actual killers had made their way to Mexico and were finding themselves struggling to get by. Of course, the reason for that was because, rather than arrive there with $10,000 like they initially hoped, they ended up going with less than $100. It wasn't exactly the kind of money that was going to keep 2 grown men afloat for long, not even in 1959. That soon led to Perry and Richard wondering if they had made a mistake by going south of the border and that maybe they would be better served by returning to the United States. At least there they'd have a better grasp of the language. Those plans were delayed for the time being when they found work in Acapulco on a fishing boat with a man who referred to himself only as the Cowboy. Back in Kansas, the funeral of the Clutter family was happening, and in keeping with how loved and respected the family were within their community, 1,000 people would attend to pay their respects. Obviously, though, hit the worst with grief were the surviving children of Herbert and Bonnie, Ivana and Beverly. They were understandably struggling to accept what happened, with the timing being particularly difficult as it was around the point Beverly was supposed to get married to her boyfriend. With most of her family now being gone, though, it meant they couldn't be there for her special day. But things were not all bad because, in what must have been a silver lining for the 2 women who had lost not only their parents, but 2 of their siblings in one fell swoop, a break in the case would soon come. Police received a tip from Floyd Wells, the man who had shared a cell with Richard Hickock while he was incarcerated at the Kansas State Penitentiary and who had first told him about the safe he believed to be on the premises of the Clutter family house at River Valley Farm. Floyd told the authorities that when he heard about the death of Herbert Clutter and his family, he knew it had to have been the work of Richard. And not only Richard, but Perry Smith too. Floyd would say, quote, "He mentioned this friend of his, Perry, a half-Indian fellow he used to sell with, and the big deals him and Perry might pull when they got together again. I never met him, Perry. Never saw him. He'd already left Lansing, was out on parole, but Dick always said if the chance of a real big score came up, he could rely on Perry Smith to go partners." Investigators took the information and began trying to locate the two men they now had as their prime suspects. It was while doing so that they talked to Richard's father, Walter Hickock, someone who advised them that upon release from prison, both his son and Perry had spent time with him at his house. Most importantly, they had been absent during the evening of the actual murders, giving them no alibi for their whereabouts on the morning of November 15th. Of course, that only heightens suspicions. And from the point of view of the two killers, the investigation into them couldn't have come at a worse time because by then, having once more found themselves out of work and hungry down in Mexico, they made the decision to return to America in hopes of finding work there. That was what led them to eventually heading all the way back to Kansas City, a poor choice in both hindsight and foresight. It was there, while writing a series of checks in their own names and doing little to hide their identities, that Special Agent Dewey became aware that they had returned to the state. Perhaps realizing they were too exposed where they were, the pair soon left the state and crisscrossed around the country, traveling through Arkansas, Florida, and eventually Arizona, all while Dewey and his team continued to track them the entire way. It was in Nevada that they were finally caught. While visiting a post office in Las Vegas to pick up a parcel they'd mailed to themselves from Mexico, the net would close in on Richard and Perry. After being spotted by two officers who were out on patrol, the two prime suspects would at last be arrested and taken in for questioning at the Las Vegas City Jail. Once the questioning began, it wouldn't take long for them both to confess to what they had done. Interestingly, though, while at first Perry would claim that his co-conspirator had been the one to actually kill Bonnie and Nancy, he would eventually recant that and argue that it was he and he alone who had pulled the trigger on all four members of the household. As to why he had changed his mind, well, according to Truman Capote, that would be because he had a lot of respect for Richard's mother and didn't want to see her suffer the shame of having a killer for a son. The reason Capote knew that was because, as part of the research for his book, he had gotten into contact with both Perry and Richard while they were behind bars, with him growing particularly close to the former during that time. They became so close that Capote himself would later question the appropriateness of such a friendship, given he was supposed to be acting as a journalist and covering the situation, and he wouldn't be the only one who questioned the relationship. Others would do the same when they eventually read the work he'd created covering the crimes, In Cold Blood, with many arguing that the book went a little too soft on Perry by trying too hard to humanize him. Whether or not that was true, though, In Cold Blood would be destined to be a huge success, big enough to keep the Clutter family murders in the minds of the public for decades thereafter. Not that it was an obscure case at that time, of course. After an article was published in Time magazine on January 18, 1960, entitled Kansas the Killers, the entirety of America suddenly became aware of what had happened down in Holcomb. That soon led to a discussion about whether or not Perry and Richard had actually been the perpetrators of another murder about a month after they'd killed the Clutters. That one had taken place on December 19, 1959 in Osprey, Florida. Cliff and Christine Walker and their two children were murdered after their home was also broken into in the middle of the night. As investigators speculated back then, given the fact that two men fitting the description of the pair had just been seen a few miles from the Walker home on the day of their deaths. Since it was known that Richard and Perry were in Florida around that time, it was reasonable to label them as suspects. That said, once a polygraph test was administered to both Perry and Richard and they passed, they were ruled out. Many still believe they were more than likely the guilty parties, especially since the case is still unsolved today. But that doesn't matter. All that matters was what the law could prove, and what the law believed they could prove was that the pair had killed the Clutter family. Their trial began in March of 1960, and the prosecution were quietly confident about getting the verdict they wanted. Still, though, the defense team was not going to make things easy for them. They did everything they could to ensure Perry and Richard at least got off without suffering the death penalty. It seemed like there wasn't much they could do to prevent that, so the defense fell back on an insanity plea. They put the defendants through comprehensive psychological testing designed to see if they were legally insane at the time the murders took place. The way they saw it, if they could prove that, then the pair could not be held accountable for their actions on the morning of November 15, 1959. Unfortunately for the defense, however, after numerous local doctors pronounced the two men to be sane, the trial would go ahead without any further delay. It would be pretty cut and dry because, with them already having admitted to what they had done, there was no doubt the jury was going to find them guilty of murder. Given their convictions carried a mandatory death sentence in the state of Kansas back in 1960, that meant there was no doubt about what was going to come next. The only question was when it would happen. That was something Perry and Richard would have to wonder about every day of the next 5 years, as their lawyer tried and failed to get an appeal heard by the United States Supreme Court on 3 separate occasions. Not that there was ever any real hope of their appeals being granted. By that point, both killers knew what the future held for them and they had accepted it. Something that became more and more evident to Truman Capote the more he interviewed them while they were being held on death row. At that point, Capote was still gathering information about the book he would soon publish on the murders. And it was during that time that he grew so close to Perry in particular, he began to question whether or not the death penalty was justified. Sure, he realized that Perry and his co-conspirator had committed murder. Of that fact, there was no doubt. But even then, the writer had come to believe that after getting to know the two men and seeing what had ultimately led them down that path in life, state-sponsored execution just wasn't something he could support. And he wasn't the only person who felt that way. As a result of how public the trial had been, a larger national discussion had begun to take place about the ethics of the death penalty, especially when mental illness was potentially involved. The way some saw it, the McNaughton rules under which Perry and Richard had been found to be sane were inadequate in setting up a baseline of what should be considered mentally healthy, as it did not account for many key factors that had by then been accepted by more modern understandings of the brain and mental health. That said, none of that would change the fact that the men responsible for the murders of the Clutter family were going to be executed. It was just a case of when, and that would eventually come on April 14, 1965. That was the day both Perry Smith and Richard Hickock were hanged, with the former being officially pronounced dead first at 12:41 a.m., and the latter being pronounced dead less than an hour later at 1:19 a.m. So just like that, the story of the two killers came to an end. But that wouldn't be the end of the story for those left behind. For the people of Holcomb and its neighboring areas, the scars left by the tragedy would be deep and would remain with them for a long time thereafter. As a 1966 article published in the New York Times put it when describing how any sense of neighborliness in that community had now evaporated, quote, "The natural order seemed suspended. Chaos poised to rush in." As it would be reported then, many had simply lost their trust in others given what had happened, and had now taken to locking their doors at night, something they would have never even considered doing before. As for the surviving Clutter children, Ivana and Beverly, they did everything they could to move on from the situation and carry on with their lives as best they could, with them largely remaining silent and outside the public eye for decades following the murders. For Beverly's part, after she got married, she and her husband moved to Illinois where he studied veterinary medicine. When it came to Ivana, she, her husband, and their son all remained in Florida where they were already living at the time of her family's brutal slaying. Then there was Truman Capote, the man who had grown so close to the killers as he researched the case, all with the aim of eventually writing a book about it. It would be in January of 1966, less than a year after the executions, that In Cold Blood would first hit bookshelves in novel form after first appearing as a 4-part series in The New Yorker a few months prior. Of course, pretty quickly after that, it would grow into a phenomenon as the story and the writing style of Capote gripped readers all over the world. It would prove to be such a hit, it would pretty much birth the true crime genre that has come along in the years since. Not that the surviving members of the Clutter family were completely happy with the book, though. To them it was littered with inaccuracies and assumptions, more of a fiction based on fact than a fact itself. And they weren't alone in that opinion. In fact, one review by author Philip K. Tompkins would state, quote, "Despite the brilliance of his self-publicizing efforts, Capote has made both a tactical and moral error that will hurt him in the short run. By insisting that every word of his book is true, he has made himself vulnerable to those readers who are prepared to examine seriously such a sweeping claim." The Clutter family felt so strongly that the record needed to be set straight. In 2017, surviving members would even take part in a documentary for Sundance TV entitled Cold-Blooded: The Clutter Family Murders. That would be the first time any one of them had spoken publicly since the killings took place. As an unnamed granddaughter of Herbert and Bonnie Clutter would state prior to the documentary's release, quote, "With this project, we felt like it was the right time and the right venue as a documentary to get the true story out about who Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon Clutter were as people, not just how they died." It was actually a perfect time to release the documentary because it was a time when the Clutter family murders were back in the public eye again. Only a few years prior, in 2012, the bodies of Perry Smith and Richard Hickock were exhumed from their resting place at Mount Muncie Cemetery so that DNA evidence could be taken. Authorities were hoping they could prove once and for all if they had indeed been responsible for the deaths of the Walker family too. In the end, though, no DNA match could be found when samples taken from the two men were compared to semen found on the pants of Christine Walker. With the possibility that the DNA from the semen could have degraded over the years, making it difficult to match with anything, Perry and Richard remain two of the most likely suspects in those killings to this day regardless. It was in 2017, around the time the surviving members of the Clutters were releasing their new documentary, that the Wall Street Journal reported on a handwritten manuscript written by Richard Hickock while he was awaiting execution on death row. The manuscript claimed he had been paid $5,000 to carry out the murders by a man known only as Roberts. In his own words, quote, "I was going to kill a person, maybe more than one. Could I do it? Maybe I'll back out, but I can't back out. I've taken the money. I've spent some of it. Besides, I thought, I know too much." In the end, though, few believed the story was real, with even the writer of the article arguing that had it been true, Richard would have likely used it as a way of trying to negotiate getting out of the death penalty at the time. On top of that, had he been paid $5,000 for the job, then it was unlikely he and Perry would have struggled with money so much while down in Mexico. No, it was far more probable that Richard was simply lying when he wrote the document. That means both he and Perry are the only ones who can be blamed for committing a crime so brutal and infamous, the after effects of it are still being felt to this day, and they have been added to my list of monsters. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave us a comment. You can check out our other show, Somewhere Sinister, on YouTube or anywhere that you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.